Hi, I'm Ashy, and this is Crafty with Ashy. Today, I am going to demonstrate this drawing process and painting process of a bird. It's called a turquoise-browed MotMot, and I was just really drawn to this bird because it was super bright and colorful and just so interesting with the way that its tail was shaped. So just starting with the sketch here. So just very lightly with a basic mechanical pencil, I'm just going in and getting the basic shape of the bird. So I started with the kind of head and one side and then went on to the beak just to get that general shape in, and adding in kind of a circle for the eye, and then where the dark, I like to consider it eyeliner for this bird, where the eyeliner is. And I do kind of adjust this shape a few times with using the kneaded eraser to erase, just to get it a nice smooth shape that I want here. So I'm just going to kind of generally show you the sketching process here. And this is sped up by 2 times. So I did kind of think about each of these steps just slightly longer than what it appears, but also not way too long. So I'm using a reference photo to get the basic shape of this bird and for the colors and everything. So going in with the wings and then adding that little line for where the belly is, getting some separation between the 2 wings here, and then just where the end of the wings is. And just very loosely, I'm holding the pencil very far down or up, whichever way you want to describe it, very far away from the tip to make it nice and loose. So again, added just very loosely that tail, and then the 2 lines that go down to these extra little feathers that kind of look like paddles here at the very end, and getting those sketched in. And then I use my kneaded eraser, and the way that I like to lighten up the sketch is to kind of roll the kneaded eraser over it, and I find that that picks up just enough of the sketch to make it nice and light, but also keeps enough of the graphite there that I can see it. I guess I forgot that I did add this branch in as well with the sketch, so just kind of loosely, jaggedly adding in that line for the branch that the bird is sitting on. And then here you see that rolling technique for lightening up the sketch, and that just makes it to where it doesn't show through the watercolor. Since watercolor is a transparent medium, if you do it over a dark pencil line, you're going to see the pencil underneath it, and you can't erase the pencil after you sketch. Now, I did add in some darker lines here for the beak and, like I said, that eyeliner area and the ends of some of these feathers, which are black or very dark colored feathers. So I could go a little bit darker in with that pencil. Then I start the actual painting part with the background. And so for this, I wet up the entire background here, and then just with a very large brush, add in some yellows and kind of gold colors and greens, just for a nice loose background that is basically blurred out. And so there's not a lot of detail here. You can just tell that it's going to be some green foliage in the background, and it's nice warm colors. So you'll just see that I kind of build up here with some golds and some browns and greens, and I go in with splatters because I love splatters. I just love the effect, the looseness that achieves, and it's very freeing for the painting process to have some splatters in there. And for me, at least, it just loosens me up and makes it to where I'm not so like precious about the painting. So then again, like I said, just adding in greens, and I just started very light. So yellows are the lightest colors, and I'm working my way up to the darker greens as I go, and just preserving some light areas to keep what appears to be more of a highlight. And as you can see, by doing this all wet on wet, it just stays nice and loose and free, and it all kind of blends and bleeds out into each other. So there's no real distinct areas here. And that was really the look that I was going for. Now, whenever I splatter and if I get some on areas that I want to stay white, if you lift it up while it's still wet, it very easily kind of removes the paint. Now, if you wait for it to dry, you can still do some lifting techniques, but it's not as simple. So after I let that dry, I go in and start painting on the bird. And I started with this bright kind of turquoisey, well, duh, it's called a turquoise-browed MotMot, so I guess turquoise is the right color, but this greenish blue color, and I used my cobalt blue mixed with a little bit of yellow just to get that nice turquoise color. And I'm adding that into the areas that are kind of the lightest first. So the bird has greens and blues and some kind of like almost reddish coppery colors. And so I'm going in with the blues first, and I'm not worried here about getting precision, especially in the areas that it's going to be covered with some black feathers. Definitely not worried about any precision. And these feathers are kind of like layered on top of each other. So having the kind of top parts of the wings a little bit jagged will help create that kind of blended, layered texture look of the feathers. So I'm, again, just sticking with this turquoise color for right now and going into all the areas of the bird that has this color. So the tail, the wings, and the brow area, which I am 100% sure that that's where this thing got its name. That brow area has that bright turquoise swatch almost above the eye. So then after going with that turquoise color, I went in with the kind of orange coppery color because I felt like that was the next lightest area of the bird, was this orangish color. And I'm just kind of, again, dropping that in nice and loosely and very pale at first, and then going in with the greens after that. And the kind of copper orange color is still wet, so it's gonna bleed into each other a little bit, but because that orange color is so light and the green is so warm and almost leaning toward yellow, it's not going to create any like muddy brown colors if they do blend a little bit, especially being careful to not kind of over blend those two colors. So don't be afraid to stay wet on wet sometimes, especially if you're not looking for any distinct lines between your two colors. So then going up on the head, and here I am being a little bit more careful around the edge and around where the turquoise is on the brow, because I don't want those colors to blend. That I do want to be a bit more distinct. And the turquoise here is dry, so I'm not worried about getting that wet on wet bleed between those two colors. As I continue to layer here, it is still damp, so I'm not going to get any significant texture here, but I am kind of doing those short sweepy motions with the tip of my brush to start to build just a little bit of the texture. It is going to blend out some, but as it dries and gets into more of a wet on damp stage, you're going to get, I guess, more minimal bleeding. It's still not going to be a super precise line, but it's going to kind of have that soft texture. So again, just continuing to build up layers here. So adding more and more depth with each layer. And you can see that first layer really just kind of blocked in where the colors went. And now I'm adding in more depth and dimension to these colors and to, again, that texture that I want to achieve to make it look like actual feathers. without painting each specific feather. So here I'm just really paying attention to where the shadows would be to help distinguish where the two wings are and then kind of where they overlap the tail. And that just, again, creates that depth. And here on the head, just creating some highlight areas and making sure that the light is portrayed appropriately, because light is very important for creating a three-dimensional object when you are painting. So creating shadows and highlights is really the key to creating depth and dimension in a painting. So here I'm just very loosely and lightly painting in the branch, and I'm using just a very watery mix of brown right now. I think that's burnt sienna mixed with whatever is there in the palette. Probably some burnt umber, probably some Payne's gray, I don't know. But it's a very watery mix first to just create the general shape. And I'm not being really precise on the brush strokes. You don't want this branch to be just like a straight line across the page. Branches have some natural curves and jaggedness to it. And then just mixing up a deeper color and wet on wet, applying that to the lower half of the branch to create shadow. And again, that depth to show that it's three-dimensional. And just being selective in where I'm putting the shadows. So definitely on the underside of the branch. And then whenever there's kind of a division between the branches, you would get a little bit more shadow, even kind of on the top part of the lower division, if that makes sense. So now the bird is dry, so just going in and adding, again, just kind of a layer of texture. So a little bit of a dry brush technique, and then just using the tip of my brush at times to create kind of individual little feathery brush strokes. But overall, really utilizing the dry brush technique to create that texture and just pick up the texture of the page. And that's a really nice, simple, and efficient way to create texture in a painting is to use dry brushing. Here I'm just adding the tiny bit of the belly that's peeking out, and it's that kind of coppery color. And I think that that just adds a little bit of, I guess, additional depth, but also a little bit more perspective for the angle that this bird is sitting at. Here, just continuing to add additional layers of turquoise. Again, just all the colors to really make those colors pop a lot more. And by doing it wet on dry, it is creating a little bit more texture. So kind of, again, going between wet and dry with very small brush strokes and dry brushing technique. Now going into that branch to let the bird dry. So I work on a different part. And here's where I'm adding my deepest shadows, and I'm using a fine liner or rigger brush to just allow for that nice loose line and holding it way far back for not that much control so that I can have that jagged, bouncy look of the branch. And by adding this deepest value here, it really makes that branch pop a lot more. And I just really kind of enjoy that step of the painting, just adding in that deepest value for the shadow and just a tiny bit of texture on the branch. It just makes it appear so much more lifelike. Now we're going in with some nice dark colors here. So this is mostly Payne's gray, a little bit of ultramarine blue to kind of make it even a little bit more on the bluer end, even though Payne's gray does have a blue hue to it. But just going in now for, like I said, this eyeliner area and the eye itself, ensuring that I'm leaving just the smallest highlight on the eye, and that brings like life and reflection to that so that it doesn't just look flat. So just using this fine liner brush again to really kind of carve out the area of the beak and the details around this bird's eye. And I did start slow with this and just kind of built my way up to filling in the entire beak. And the beak is kind of reflective, it's kind of shiny, so leaving just a little bit of white space very loosely in the beak to create that perception of kind of shininess. I didn't leave a lot of white space, but just enough to make it look shiny. And then with the same color, just adding in the tips of the wings and the tail. And so using just small kind of bouncy motions with the brush here to get that blended layered effect for the end of these wing feathers, so that it doesn't just look like a distinct line between the turquoise and the dark, we'll just call it black. So we want that kind of bouncy, jagged edge to it. So using just kind of that same technique for all of these areas, and just kind of following the shape of the wing with the angle of the brush strokes as well to make them kind of blend nicely. And just adding a few tiny brush strokes here for that dark color into the wings and just kind of darker values of the turquoise to create that depth and some shadow there. And then on the, I don't really know what to call this part of the bird's tail, but on this bottom part there is a very like straight distinct line between the black and the turquoise, so just really kind of carving that out and creating that black, like almost paint dipped look. And then just very loosely creating the lines that go from the actual tail to the end of the tail, don't know what to call it. And so I turned the page so that my arm was moving more in a more natural angle to create those straight, quick lines. Now here I am just using a dry brush technique with a stiffer bristle brush here to create even more texture, focusing kind of more on the greens here because I have pretty decent texture in the other areas, but the greens were lacking. So just used very similar value of green to what I used before and dry brushing on top of those areas, adding just a little bit more depth to the copper area as well, but then lifting out some of that color. So using a damp brush to kind of reactivate that paint and lift it out. And that just creates a nice highlight to, again, create that depth and perspective. And just having highlights and lowlights in the painting is very important to create interest. Now I'm just using the fine liner again to create some kind of tufty feather looks around the beak, where really that is kind of the focal point of this bird. That's where the most detail is the beak and the eye. So creating those specific kind of feather shapes is important there. The brush got away from me, so I just kind of reactivated that area where I made a mistake and blotted it up with a paper towel. It's nice part about watercolor is that you can reactivate it and lift it as long as it's not a staining color. And even if it is staining, you can do a pretty decent job of lifting up most of it and kind of hiding any mistakes. And there we have it. There's the end of the turquoise-browed MotMot. I hope you really enjoyed this painting tutorial and process. If you did, check out my channel for even more. Have an awesome day. Thanks.